My son's wife won't let me see my grandkids. The morning started out just like any other, one of those quiet, familiar routines that bring comfort. I was up early, slipping on my warmest cardigan, and watching the autumn leaves fall from the big maple tree outside my kitchen window. The smell of coffee filled the room, and I let myself settle into the little rhythm of things. A quiet house, an old favorite chair, and the warmth of a fresh cup in my hands. That was my peace. But lately, even the comfort of those small things didn't feel the same. I noticed it more and more in the last few months. My grandsons hadn't been over in weeks. At first, I convinced myself it was because of the start of the school year, or maybe just the busyness of family life. I kept reminding myself that everyone's lives are so packed these days. But that nagging feeling never went away. The silence felt almost heavy, as though my usually busy home had started to feel hollow. That morning, though, my son stopped by. I didn't expect him. It was a surprise, one that brought a bit of warmth to my heart as soon as he walked through the door. I could tell by the way he was moving around, looking for something, that this wasn't a social visit. As he shuffled through a stack of paperwork on my counter, my heart beat a little faster. Here was my chance, a rare, quiet moment with him. I could finally ask him what had been weighing on me. "Hey, Han," I said, working to keep my tone light as I set down my coffee. "Is everything okay with Carol? I haven't seen the boys as much lately." He paused mid-motion, his hand hovering over the papers he was sorting through. I saw him take a quick breath, and for a moment, I thought he might just brush it off, maybe say they were all just busy. But then he looked at me, quickly at first, as if deciding how much to say. Yeah, Mom," he replied, his voice casual but tight. "Everything's fine. Just busy, you know." He looked back down, shuffling the papers again, clearly avoiding my gaze. But I wasn't about to let it go. Something about his hesitation felt too off, like there was more to this story than he was letting on. "Busy," I repeated softly, folding my hands in my lap. "I get it. Kids are a handful, and works a lot, I know. But it's been a while. I miss them." He let out a quiet sigh, and finally met my gaze, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, and I watched him wrestle with his thoughts. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "Carol, she thinks you spoil them too much, Mom. She doesn't want them getting used to things like that." The words hung in the air between us, and I felt them hit deep, like a slow, painful echo in my chest. Spoil them? I didn't understand. The words spun around in my mind, not quite settling, like a leaf caught in a gust of wind. Spoil them? It felt like such an accusation, one I hadn't seen coming. All I'd ever wanted was to make life a little easier for my son and his family. Was that so wrong? I cleared my throat, trying to keep the ache out of my voice. Spoil them? How? I've only ever given them things that I thought would help them. I tried to keep my tone steady, though I could feel a faint tremor creeping in. Books, puzzles, art supplies. Things to keep their little minds active. He nodded, almost mechanically, still focused on the papers, his eyes never quite meeting mine. I could tell he wasn't comfortable with this conversation, but neither was I. A flash of defensiveness rose up in me, mixed with hurt. After all, hadn't I done everything to support them, to show up for them? Hadn't I been there whenever they needed help? I looked at him, trying to soften my voice, but there was a pang behind my words. If Carol didn't like the gifts, why didn't she say something sooner? You both know I would have listened. I would have done anything just to keep the peace. He shifted, finally looking up at me, and I could see the unease in his eyes. She thinks it's setting expectations, you know? Like they'll get used to being showered with things. That didn't feel right. The gifts I'd given were chosen carefully, with love and intention. They were never about extravagance. They were about sharing what little I had to give, hoping to enrich my grandson's lives in some way. I wanted to be a part of their childhood, a gentle presence that encouraged and supported them. To think that those gestures could be seen as a problem, I struggled to wrap my mind around it. I took a deep breath and decided to ask him what I feared most. Does she think I'm a bad influence? My voice sounded small, even to my own ears. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. He looked down again, rubbing the back of his neck. "No, Mom, it's not like that. She She has her own way of wanting to do things. That silence fell between us again, the kind that makes you feel like you're both in two different worlds, even though you're only a few feet apart. I felt my chest tighten as the realization began to sink in. Carol had her own way of wanting to raise her kids, and maybe I didn't fit into that vision as well as I thought I did. I just wish she would have told me, I whispered, mostly to myself. But he heard, and he looked up, his expression softening, maybe just a little. "Yeah, Mom," he said quietly. "I know." And that was it. He gathered his things, gave me a quick hug, and slipped out the door, leaving me standing there, feeling that hollow echo of his words. "Carol thinks you spoil them too much." After my son left, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the spot where he'd been just moments ago. It felt as though he'd taken a piece of my heart with him, leaving behind this uneasy silence. I turned back to my coffee, but it had gone cold, and so had the room. I couldn't shake that sinking feeling, the heaviness of his words settling into my bones. I found myself running through every memory, every moment I'd shared with my grandsons over the years. I thought of the small things I'd done, things I'd taken for granted. Taking the boys to the zoo on Saturdays, letting them pick out a stuffed animal from the gift shop as a memento. The trips to the bookstore, where we'd browse the children's section together, and they'd each pick a book for story time. That was our ritual, the smell of new pages, the look in their eyes when they found something that sparked their curiosity. Was that too much? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. My mother had been a big part of my children's lives, and I had only gratitude for the love and support she offered. The way she doted on my kids, spoiling them a little with the treats and small luxuries I could barely afford at the time. It had never felt like a problem, only a blessing. And now, here I was feeling like I'd crossed some invisible line, one I didn't even know existed. I decided to call my sister. She was a voice of reason, always steady and honest. I hoped she could help me see things clearly, to know if I'd somehow been in the wrong all along. The phone rang a few times before she picked up. "Mary, it's good to hear from you. What's going on?" she said, her voice as warm and welcoming as ever. I took a breath, trying to keep my tone light. "Oh, just thinking. It's been a while since the boys have come by, and I'm wondering if maybe I've been a bit too generous with them." I winced at how vague it sounded, but I wasn't ready to pour out all the hurt just yet. She laughed softly. "Too generous? You're their grandmother. Isn't that what we're supposed to do?" "I thought so too," I admitted. "But Carol feels differently, I guess." I paused, the words catching in my throat. "She thinks I'm spoiling them, that it's setting expectations." Silence followed on the other end, and I could feel my sister trying to choose her words carefully. That's unexpected. I thought you and Carol got along well enough." "So did I." I let out a small, shaky sigh. "I never meant to make things difficult. I wanted to be part of their lives, to give them a little extra love, "I know, Mary," she said gently. "And I think that's all any grandparent wants. Maybe Carol just has her own way of raising them, a vision she set her heart on." "Maybe," I murmured, but her words didn't ease the ache in my chest. If Carol had her own vision, then where did I fit into it? The following days felt like I was tiptoeing through my own life, watching my phone for a message or call that never came. I catch myself glancing at the little blue vase by the door, the one I'd set aside just for the boys to put their latest finds in, like pebbles or acorns. Every time they visited, they'd come in with their small treasures and a sparkle in their eyes, eager to tell me where they'd found each one. But lately, the vase had been empty, gathering dust. I tried to distract myself. I'd polished the picture frames along the hallway, each one holding a memory of my grandsons, their grinning faces and small hands gripping mine. There was a photo from 2 years ago, taken on the 4th of July. We were all at the park, and I was holding the youngest one, his tiny hands waving a sparkler. He'd been so excited, and his older brother, barely taller than my knee at the time, had clung to my leg, watching his little brother with wide eyes. Those memories, though recent, felt oddly distant now. I thought of texting Carol directly, maybe suggesting a Saturday outing like we used to do. I even drafted a message, my fingers hovering over the screen. "Hi, Carol. I'd love to take the boys to the library this weekend. Just let me know if that works." But every time I looked at the words, I felt a lump in my throat. I couldn't bear the thought of her turning me down, of her thinking I was meddling, or that I was ignoring the boundaries she'd apparently drawn without ever telling me. Instead, I texted my son a short, casual message. Hi. Hope you all are well. Let me know if the boys need anything for school. Love you all. I stared at the screen, waiting, hoping to see those 3 little dots that meant he was typing back. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, he replied with a simple, "We're good, Mom. Thanks." I tried to read between the lines, but there was nothing there. Just a flat, polite reply that felt like it belonged to a stranger. Days turned into weeks, and the silence between us grew, stretching like a tight wire that could snap at any moment. I busied myself with things around the house, gardening, organizing old keepsakes, even baking. I'd end up with plates of cookies and trays of brownies, things I used to make when I knew the boys would be coming by. But every time, I'd have to pack them up and give them to a neighbor or freeze them for another day. There was no one to share them with. Not anymore. One evening, as I was tidying up, I noticed the calendar hanging by the fridge. My heart sank as I saw that it was nearing my youngest grandson's birthday. I wondered if I'd be invited to the celebration this year, or if I'd even be able to see him at all. In years past, I'd start planning his gift months in advance, usually something small and thoughtful, a new book series he could grow into or a model kit we could build together. But this time, I felt unsure, hesitant even. I didn't know what I was allowed to give anymore. I found myself dialing my son's number before I could second-guess it. The phone rang, and I held my breath, praying he'd pick up. Just as I was about to hang up, he answered. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice cautious. "Hi, sweetheart," I replied, swallowing the nerves that tightened my throat. "I was just wondering about the little one's birthday. Is there anything he wants this year? I'd love to get him something special, if that's all right." There was a pause, and I could hear him shifting, maybe glancing around the room. "Actually, Mom, Carol thought it might be best if we keep things simple this year. Just family." His words hit me harder than I'd expected. "Just family?" I repeated, the implications settling in my chest like a stone. "Yeah," he said softly. "We're just trying to keep things low-key, you know?" I wanted to respond, to say something that would convey how deeply that cut, but I could feel my voice trembling. I didn't want him to hear that, so I forced a smile, even though he couldn't see it. "Of course. I understand." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen, my hand still holding the phone. Just family. I'd thought that was exactly what I was. But maybe somehow I'd been wrong. As my grandson's birthday crept closer, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was waiting for something. Some gesture, a sign that I hadn't been shut out. Every time my phone buzzed, I'd grab it, hoping it was a message from my son or Carol. Maybe they'd say, "We'd love to have you come by, Mom," or even just a simple, "Can you bring some of those cookies the boys like?" But the days passed, and my phone stayed silent. I watched the date circle closer on the calendar, and the quiet only grew heavier. Still, I couldn't sit by and do nothing. I went shopping and picked out a couple of small gifts. Nothing flashy, just things I knew he'd enjoy. A new set of colored pencils for his drawing. A storybook about planets, since he'd been fascinated with space last year. I even baked his favorite chocolate chip cookies, placing them carefully in a small tin. I wrapped everything in bright paper, topped with a ribbon, and set it on the counter, trying to picture his little face lighting up when he opened them. I told myself I'd just drop them by the house, give him a quick hug, and be on my way. When the day came, I spent the morning waiting, watching the clock as if it might change things. Around noon, I finally decided to call my son. It rang for what felt like forever before he finally picked up. "Hi, Mom," he answered, sounding a bit distracted. I could hear the sound of kids' voices in the background, laughter mingling with music. It sounded festive, alive. I pictured balloons, maybe streamers, the kind of excitement kids only have at a birthday party. "Hi, sweetheart. I just wanted to drop by quickly and give him his gift," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "I won't stay long, just wanted to wish him a happy birthday in person." There was a pause, a long one, and I felt that familiar ache in my chest, tightening like a vice. "Mom," he said, his voice low, "it's really not a good time. We've got a lot going on, and I don't want things to feel complicated. Carol thought it would be best if we just kept it small." I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. "I understand. I managed to say, forcing a smile, even though he couldn't see it. I just thought maybe I could just stop by quickly, even for a minute. Not today, Mom, he said, his voice firm but apologetic. I'll make sure he knows you're thinking of him, though. He'll appreciate it. All right, I whispered, barely able to push the words out. Tell him Grandma loves him. Okay. Will do, he replied, and with a soft goodbye, he hung up. I sat there in the quiet of my kitchen, the phone still in my hand. The bright package sat on the counter, untouched, a small reminder of the moments I'd imagined sharing with him. The cookies, now cooled and sealed, seemed to lose some of their warmth, sitting untouched in the little tin. I hadn't felt this alone in a long time. It was as though some invisible wall had been placed between me and my family, one I hadn't seen until I'd walked straight into it. I wanted to tell myself I was overreacting, that it was just one birthday, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was a sign of how things had shifted, how I'd somehow gone from being a constant in their lives to a complication. I didn't understand it, and I didn't know how to fix it. That night, I wrapped myself in a thick sweater, pulled out an old family photo album, and sat down at the kitchen table. I flipped through the pages, lingering on each picture. My son as a toddler, his gap-toothed grin. Photos of him as a young boy, playing in the leaves, with me chasing him. Memories of his own childhood birthday parties flashed through my mind, moments when I was his whole world. And now, just like that, I was barely a part of his. As I closed the album, I felt a tear slide down my cheek. I told myself that when he was ready, he'd come around. But until then, I wasn't sure how to fill the empty space where my family used to be. The days after my grandson's birthday passed in a haze, each one feeling emptier than the last. My heart would jump at every little sound, every car passing by, as though they might suddenly decide to drop by. I knew it was wishful thinking, but it was hard to shake the hope. Every morning, I'd find myself glancing out the window, as if they'd pull up any minute, the boys tumbling out of the car with laughter and messy hair, calling for me to come see them. But the driveway stayed empty, and the house felt quieter than ever. One evening, about a week later, I decided to try calling my son again. I knew it was risky, maybe even too soon after his birthday, but I needed to know where I stood. I dialed his number and held my breath as it rang, the familiar anxiety creeping in. After a few rings, he picked up, sounding slightly out of breath. "Hi, Mom," he answered, and there was a note of exhaustion in his voice. "Sorry, I was just putting the kids to bed." "Oh, no worries, sweetheart. I didn't mean to call at a bad time." I hesitated, feeling a strange, uncharacteristic nervousness. "I just wanted to check in, see how you all are doing." "We're okay," he said, a bit too quickly, and I could feel the distance in his tone. "Things have just been busy, with work and the kids' schedules." I nodded, swallowing the tightness in my throat. "Of course. I understand." I wasn't sure where to go from there. But before I could decide, he spoke again, his voice cautious. "Mom, I wanted to talk to you about something. I know you're trying, and I know this has been difficult." I froze, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "Of course. Go ahead." He took a breath, as if choosing his words carefully. "I just think Carol feels like there's been a lot of pressure. You've always been so involved, and while we're grateful, we need some room to do things our way, too. She's just protective, Protective. It felt like a strange choice of words. Protective of what, exactly? I wasn't sure what he meant, but I felt a prickle of defensiveness rise up, my voice a bit sharper than I intended. "I never wanted to make things difficult. I only wanted to be there for you all." He sighed softly, and for a moment, I thought he might relent. But instead, he stayed quiet, and I could feel the silence settling between us like a wall, thick and immovable. Maybe some space would be good for everyone," he said quietly, as though the words were hard for him to say. "Just a little time for things to settle." I felt a pang in my chest, a tightening that spread with each passing second. Space. The word felt so final, so absolute. All my life, I've been close to my family, the one they turned to for support and care. And now, they were asking for space, as if my presence had somehow become too much, a burden instead of a comfort. I tried to keep my voice steady, though it wavered slightly. "If that's what you need, I'll respect that. I only hope you know how much I love all of you. "We know, Mom," he replied, and there was a softness there, a glimpse of the boy I'd raised. "It's just things are different now. Carol and we need to establish our own way of doing things." I nodded, though he couldn't see it, feeling that all too familiar ache settle deeper. "I understand," I murmured. "I just miss the boys. Please tell them I think of them every day." "I will," he promised, and for a moment, I thought I heard a trace of regret in his voice. But then the moment passed. "Take care, Mom." He hung up, and I sat there, the empty silence ringing in my ears. I set the phone down and looked around the room, at the familiar trinkets and framed photos lining the shelves. Memories of family gatherings, of holidays spent together, filled the spaces around me. But now those memories felt distant, like they belonged to another lifetime. I knew I'd have to learn to live with this new reality, this widening gap between me and the family I'd once been at the heart of. But as I sat there, surrounded by the echoes of a life that now felt far away, I wasn't sure where to begin. The next few weeks drifted by, each day blending into the next with a soft, hollow rhythm. Mornings were the hardest. I'd wake early, the house still wrapped in shadows, and for just a moment, I'd forget. I'd lie there, half asleep, waiting for the sounds of small footsteps racing down the hallway, the boys' laughter echoing through the house. But then reality would settle in, and I'd remember. The boys weren't coming. Not today, maybe not for a long time. I tried to fill the days, to keep myself from watching the door, from jumping at every sound or feeling that familiar tug to reach for the phone. It was a strange kind of discipline, resisting the urge to call my son. It felt as though I were pacing inside an invisible cage, keeping myself from crossing a line I didn't fully understand but somehow respected. So, I leaned into the little things, the chores and habits I'd always taken for granted. I spent more time in the garden, my hands deep in the cool soil as I pulled weeds and planted new flowers. I pruned the rose bushes, talking to them quietly as I worked, half imagining I was tending to something that could hear me, that understood. Inside the house, organized the closets, sorting through winter coats that hadn't been worn in years, old quilts, blankets, and even some of my son's baby clothes that I'd saved. Each item felt like a small memory tucked away. I found myself lingering over them, letting them breathe for a moment before carefully folding them up again and putting them back in their places. Cooking became a kind of ritual. I'd go through old recipes I'd once made with the boys in mind. Spaghetti with extra Parmesan for my oldest grandson, who loved sprinkling cheese on his own plate, or the oatmeal cookies we'd make together, rolling out the dough and sneaking bites when I pretended not to notice. I'd stand at the stove, stirring slowly, trying to picture them around the kitchen, the two of them giggling and leaving smudgy fingerprints on the countertops. But when the meals were done, it was just me at the table, the familiar clang of a single plate and fork filling the air. I'd package the leftovers and set them in the freezer, as though preparing for a visit that I knew might not come. I started giving extra cookies and muffins to neighbors, quietly passing them along with a small smile, saying they just made too much, as though my kitchen had a life of its own. Each evening, I'd find myself reaching for my phone, picking it up, almost pressing my son's name. But each time, I'd stop myself, his words echoing in my mind. Maybe some space would be good. Those words had started to feel like a wall I couldn't get past. So I'd set the phone down and let the silence wrap around me, trying to convince myself that this was for the best. The house felt like a stranger's home at times, filled with quiet corners and unused rooms that seemed frozen in time. I'd wander from room to room, dusting shelves and rearranging books, trying to find new places for things that hadn't moved in years. I'd pause by the boys' room, which I still called the boys' room out of habit, even though it was just an empty space now. Their toys were tucked neatly on the shelf, their blankets folded on the beds as if waiting for their little owners to return. With each day that passed, the silence settled deeper, stretching out like a heavy, invisible companion I was learning to live with. It was a strange, slow acceptance, a kind of surrender to the quiet that wrapped around everything, softening the edges of my heart, teaching me to carry my love quietly, without the reassurance of being seen or heard. One bright afternoon, I decided to go into town for a few errands. The house had felt unusually empty, the quiet stretching in a way that seemed almost endless. So I grabbed my shopping list, hoping the bustle of town would distract me for a little while, maybe shake off the weight of the past few weeks. I swung by the grocery store first, ticking off items one by one. Bread, milk, pasta, a few fresh vegetables. I picked up some ingredients to make a new soup recipe I'd been meaning to try, thinking that maybe it would help keep my mind occupied. My last stop was the library. I'd been gathering books for the boys over the past few months, things I thought they might enjoy like storybooks on space and dinosaurs, a few early readers, and a couple of activity books filled with puzzles. Since they hadn't been around to give them to, I decided to donate the books to the library's children's section. It felt a little like letting go, but in a way that seemed fitting, like passing along a bit of my love for them to other little ones who might need it. As I left the library, a warm breeze carried the sound of laughter across the street. I glanced over and felt my heart skip as I recognized the voices. My grandsons, their bright, familiar giggles unmistakable as they played on the swings at the small park nearby. They looked happy, each of them taking turns pushing the other, their faces lit up with the pure, careless joy that only children seem to have. I saw Carol there, too, seated on a nearby bench, her face focused on her phone. I stood there on the sidewalk, rooted to the spot, watching them from a distance. My feet ached to move forward, to call out their names, to see their faces light up as they ran over to me, arms wide open, just like they used to. I imagined how it would feel to hug them close, to hear their little voices calling, "Grandma." But as the moment stretched on, I found myself frozen, held back by the memory of my son's last words to me. Maybe some space would be good. I wanted to walk over. I wanted so badly to reach them. But those words kept echoing in my mind, and they felt like a barrier I didn't know how to cross. I remembered the way my son's tone had softened when he said it, the quiet finality in his voice. This wasn't my place right now. I couldn't break that unspoken rule he'd set. So I stayed where I was, a quiet onlooker, holding my breath as I took in every detail. I watched my oldest grandson pump his legs high on the swing, fearless as he soared, his little brother laughing up at him from below, hands clapping with excitement. I watched Carol lift her gaze from her phone, her face softening as she glanced at the boys, a small smile playing at her lips. For a fleeting moment, I thought she might see me standing there, that maybe we'd exchange a wave or a polite nod, some silent acknowledgement. But she turned her attention back to the boys, completely unaware of my presence, as if I were just another passerby. The realization stung, cutting deep, and I couldn't help but wonder if this was what things had come to, me, watching my own family from a distance, as if I were a stranger in their lives. I stayed there, watching for as long as I could bear it, drinking in the sight of them, capturing each little detail in my mind. It was a bittersweet comfort, seeing them so happy and carefree, but it reminded me just how far I felt from that happiness myself. After a while, my legs felt heavy, as if they'd taken on the weight of all my unspoken words and unshed tears. I forced myself to turn away, each step feeling like a silent goodbye to the moment I'd hoped to share with them. As I walked back to my car, I felt the ache settle deeper. I couldn't help but wonder if there would be a day when I'd finally be able to join them again, or if this distance was something I'd have to learn to live with, watching from the sidelines, a silent stranger in their lives. A few weeks later, I heard through a family friend that there had been a birthday party for my oldest grandson, a bigger celebration than usual, with extended family, neighbors, even some of my son's childhood friends. I could almost picture it, the backyard decorated, kids running around, laughter echoing through the house. I hadn't been invited. Not a word about it had reached me, not even in passing. It felt like a strange twist of reality, as though my family had moved on to some new chapter and left me on the outside, peering in through a window. For the first time, I wondered if this space wasn't just temporary. I sat alone in my quiet house that evening, replaying memories of birthdays I had hosted in the past, my heart aching as I thought of how I might be missing out on memories that would go on without me. As the days passed, I realized I couldn't keep living in this limbo, constantly wondering if things would change, if I'd be part of my family's life again. The ache of not knowing, of waiting and hoping, was becoming too heavy to carry. I needed to take a step forward, even if that meant learning to let go. That night, I sat down with a notebook and made a list of all the things I'd put on hold, waiting for the boys to be back in my life. Trips I'd planned to take them on, crafts I'd saved for rainy days, stories I'd wanted to share with them. As I crossed each one off, I felt a strange, bittersweet relief. Maybe it was time to start living for myself again, in small ways, without waiting for a future that seemed so uncertain. I decided that if my family wanted to reach out, I would be here, ready with open arms. But I wouldn't spend my days waiting anymore. In the weeks that followed, I took small steps to rebuild my life around the quiet. I began volunteering at the local library, where I found joy in reading to children who would gather eagerly for story time. Their laughter, their curious questions. It reminded me of my grandsons, and while it wasn't the same, it filled a part of the emptiness. I reconnected with old friends, joined a garden club, even enrolled in a pottery class I'd been curious about for years. Bit by bit, I was rediscovering pieces of myself that had been tucked away, waiting. And as I settled into this new routine, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, a sense of peace. The ache was still there, and the longing for my family hadn't disappeared, but I was learning to carry it more gently. One afternoon, as I was packing up after story time, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my son. "Mom, the boys have been asking about you. Let's plan a visit soon." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, and a tear slipped down my cheek. For the first time in a long time, it felt like hope was within reach.